All right, are you ready for Isaiah 6? Dangerous prayers. We looked at the first two dangerous prayers the last 2 weeks. They were, search me. God, search my heart. Search me for who I am. Search me from the very depths of who I am. And then the second one, break me, which is a hard one. God, break me and break my heart for what breaks yours. And today we're going to see a third one, and it's this, send me. Look with me at Isaiah chapter 6, starting in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim were standing above him, and they each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. His glory fills the whole earth. And the foundations of the doorways shook at the sound of their voices, and the temple was filled with smoke. Then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I'm a man of unclean lips and live among a people of unclean lips, and because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of armies. And then one of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand was a glowing coal that he had taken from the altar with tongs. And he touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your iniquity is removed and your sin is atoned for. And then I heard the voice of the Lord asking, Who will I send? And who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. What we don't know, just reading these first 8 verses of Isaiah chapter 6, is really what's going on throughout this whole narrative. You would think that Isaiah chapter 6, what we just read, would be found in Isaiah chapter 1, the call of Isaiah to be a prophet of God, but we find it 6 chapters in, and it says there in verse 4 or verse 1 of chapter 6, in the year King Uzziah died. Well, that's important to the information and the narrative of the story. I told you last week that all throughout the Israel history, the Israelites would go from being good with God to not good with God, and it always was predicated on what king they had. In fact, if they had a good king, the good king would lead them to follow the Lord. If they had a bad king, the bad king would lead them to follow false gods and the gods all around them, and they would build Asherah poles and idols and all kinds of things. But Uzziah was actually a good king. But if you read through the Old Testament, you'll find that Uzziah didn't follow, at least the end of his life, didn't follow what typically would happen when a king would die, his son would take over. But his son was Jotham. And Jotham actually took over a few years before Uzziah died. And we find out in the Old Testament that Uzziah came down with this severe skin disease. And it made him incapable of leading. So even though he was still alive, he was kind of a co-regent or a co-king with his son Jotham for a while. Jotham was also a good king. And Jotham and Uzziah, in the last years of Uzziah's life, they led Israel in the way that God would have them to go. But then you have Jotham's son. And so many scholars believe that the way this is written, in the year that King Uzziah died, even though he was not the one that died and someone took over, it actually reads that Jotham may have died before Uzziah, meaning that King Ahaz, Jotham's son, was the king now. And you see that in chapter 7. And Ahaz was a terrible king. He led them away. And so what Isaiah is being called to here in chapter 6, after all these years, he's of prosperity under Uzziah, and there were a lot of years that Uzziah reigned. I believe it was like 52 years that Uzziah reigned, a long term. He started when he was 16. Can you imagine electing a president at 16? And so after all these years of prosperity, because they were following God, and then Jotham passes away, and now Ahaz has turned his back on God, and he is now leading them to follow false gods. Isaiah now is called to prophesy against the nation of Israel. It's not going to be a happy message that Isaiah is called to prophesy. So that's the background of what's happening. But the first thing I want us to see in this passage is I want us to see that Isaiah saw God for who He is. And the first thing you and I have to do, if we're going to pray the prayer of send me, we have to see God for who He is. Look what it says. He says, I saw the Lord. By the way, this little first two phrases, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. What does that tell us? That tells me that the king of Israel died, but the true king of Israel was still around. What does that tell us as American believers? That the throne of America, the presidency of America may be corrupt, may be backwards, may be all these things, but there is still a Lord seated on a throne high and lofty. And so we look to Him. We don't look to King Uzziah. We don't look to our president. We look to the Lord seated high and lofty on a throne. And that's exactly what Isaiah said. And then he said, He was so high and lofty that the hem of His robe filled the temple. Think about it. The very bottom of His robe filled the temple, and then there are these angels, these seraphim, who were standing above Him. They had 6 wings. They covered their faces with 2. They covered their feet with 2, and with 2 they were flying. And they called to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. His glory fills the whole earth. And the foundations of the doorways shook at the sound of their voices, and the temple was filled with smoke. So even though Uzziah had died, Ahaz had taken over. And Ahaz, as we know throughout history, was going to lead Israel in the wrong direction. We know that the Lord was still on His throne, and His glory filled the whole earth, and the hem of His garment, the hem of His robe, the very bottom of His robe, it filled the temple. Now that's an interesting word there, temple. It actually in the Hebrew could mean temple, but it also could be the word used for palace. So I want you to think about this for a second. Uzziah dies, and they are in the middle. In the year he died, they are in the middle of a transition. They are in the middle of succession, of kingship, earthly kingship. But yet here is God seated high and lofty on His throne, and the palace, which would have been the grandest of all, is filled with the hem of His garment. If you and I are going to be sent, if you and I are going to pray that prayer, send me, the first thing that we have to do is see God as Isaiah saw God. We have to see God for being who He is. We have to see that He's high and lofty. We have to see that He's far above us. We have to see that His ways are better than our ways. We have to see that His glory fills the whole earth. By the way, your glory won't even fill this room, much less your shoe. But His glory fills the whole earth. He is high and lofty. So we have to see God for who He is. And then the second thing we have to do is found in verse 5. We have to see ourselves for who we are. Look at verse 5. Look what he says. After Isaiah sees God for who He is, he says, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of armies. See, when you see God for who He is, you see yourself for how you are. You see yourself and how sinful you are. You see yourself and how dirty you are compared to God. You see yourself and you see yourself as unholy because you are unholy compared to God. And so the problem with us is we always measure ourselves against the person that's just a little bit less than us. Right? I mean, that's our problem. Our problem is, well, you know, I'm a little bit dirty, but man, look at that person. They're really dirty. Like, look at those people. I don't act like those people, and so I must be good. But Isaiah, if you notice, he doesn't see himself matched up against other people. He sees God for who He is, and when he sees God for who He is, it really is a mirror into his own heart, and he says, Woe is me, for I am ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, and he recognizes everybody else around me. These other people around me, the people I live among, they're a people of unclean lips. Why do I say this? Isaiah says, because I've seen the King. Maybe today our issue is not that we're unclean. We're all unclean, we know it. Maybe the issue is we haven't seen God for who He is, and that leads us to not see how unclean we are. By the way, this isn't an unclean like you can get in the shower for 30 minutes and it's all gone. This is an uncleanness that comes from the heart, that comes from the inside. That the uncleanness, the unholiness in us, it can only be healed by the one who is holy, the one who is high, the one who is lofty, the one who is seated on His throne. And so we see God for who He is. We see ourselves for who we are. And then here's where the rubber meets the road. Are you ready for the rubber meet the road? It's in verses 6 and 7. We have to be willing to allow God to change us. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand was a glowing coal that he had taken from the altar with tongs. And he touched my mouth with it and said, "Now that this has touched your lips, your iniquity is removed and your sin is atoned for." So when we recognize who God is, when we see how unclean we are, and we see ourselves for who we are, then God then wants to come and clean us up. And so our dangerous prayers so far have been search me, they've been break me, and now they're send me. But you see how all of these kind of work together, because this is Isaiah saying, hey, search me. God, you've searched me. I'm unclean. Okay, now break me. By the way, I don't know if you've had fiery glowing coals touched to your lips before. I'm fairly confident that that's not a pleasant experience. I don't want to try it. If you want to try it, there's something wrong with you. But you can imagine in your mind that this is not something that's just easy. This is not something that's just fun and pleasant. We talked about this last week. When God breaks us, He breaks us. And it's painful. And it hurts. And in Isaiah's case, he takes the glowing coal and he touches his lips with it. But in the process, he heals Isaiah. He heals his soul. He cleanses him. Look what it says there. He says, he touched my mouth with it, and this is what the seraphim said. Now that this has touched your lips, your iniquity is removed and your sin is atoned for. So when we recognize who God is and we see Him for who He really is, then we see ourselves for who we are. And by the way, those two things are tied together. But then we can't leave it right there. We have to allow Him and be willing for Him to change us. And when we ask Him to change us, notice that Isaiah in this vision, he didn't run away. In fact, he didn't say, hey, seraphim, I know you're coming. If you'll just give me like 2 weeks. Teenagers, he didn't say, hey, let me go sow my wild oats, and then when I'm done with college, then you can come and do all that cleansing. It's not what he said. In fact, he had seen God, and when you see God for who He is, you cannot reject Him. I believe that. When you see God for who He really is, when you see that His glory fills the whole earth, when you see that the train of His robe or the hem of His robe fills the temple, you cannot reject Him. The problem for many people is they haven't seen God for who He is. They see God for who they want Him to be. They see God for who culture portrays Him as. They see God as this figment of their imagination that they've made up. By the way, when you decide that you're going to see God for who He is, by the way, the Bible is very accurate in its description of who God is. And so when, for example, culture would say, well, God wouldn't do that, and God didn't say that. Well, our question is not, did he or did he not? Our question is, does the Bible tell us whether He did or He did not, or He is or He is not? And so the Bible is accurate. Again, the problem is we don't read our Bibles, so how can we know who God is if we don't read our Bibles? Seek 24, by the way, there's a reading plan out on the welcome station. If you're not doing that, if you're not reading your Bible at all, I would encourage you to pick that up, read your Bible, even a couple of verses a day. I like to say, an apple a day keeps, all that. A couple of verses a day will keep the sin away. At least help. So we see God for who He is. We see ourselves for who we are. We are willing to allow God to change us. And then you get to verse 8. In verse 8, I would call this giving God a blank check with our lives. Giving God a blank check with our lives. Then I heard the voice of the Lord asking, who will I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here I am. Send me. You do not get to verse 8 without verses 1 through 7. Nobody in this world gets to verse 8, here I am, send me, without getting through verse 1 through 7. Seeing God for who He is, seeing yourself for who you are, and allowing Him to change you. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to give whoever, whatever, a blank check with my life without going through that experience of knowing who you're giving the blank check to. So we have to see God for who He is, and then we have to see ourselves for who He is, and then we have to allow Him to change us. And once we've gone through all that process of search me and break me, then we can go to send me. And by the way, next week we're going to look at the last one, use me. And if you have not gone through verses 1 through 7, if you've not gone through the dangerous prayers of search me and break me and send me, then you definitely can't be used by God the way He wants to use you. It's all a process. They're not individual prayers. And so here He says, God says, who will I send? And who will go for us? Let me ask you a question. Do you think God knew who He wanted to send? Do you think God knew the answer to those first two questions? Who will I send and who will go for us? I want you to notice what He says. Who will go for us? Who's the us? Well, the us could be the Trinity. The us could be the people. Who's going to be the one, God says, to go and give a message? By the way, a lot of preachers use this as a call narrative. We would call it a call narrative. And we'd say, well, who will I send? Who will go for us? And preachers and missionaries, they say, here I am, send me. I believe it's wrong of us to say this is only applicable to ministers and missionaries. This is something that should be applied and said by every single one of us. Every single one of us. Listen, you're Southern Baptist. Some of y'all didn't even know you're Southern Baptist. Welcome to Southern Baptist Life. We have a thing in Southern Baptist Life. Here's what we say. Every member a minister. What does that mean? That means that the ministry is not reserved for just a few select people that God calls out to do ministry. Now, we do believe there is a vocational ministry call. And I believe in that very strongly. I believe that God will call some people out, like myself, like Preston, who will serve in this role in a church somewhere. That is definitely very biblical. But it's not biblical to say that God has called those people to do the ministry and everybody else to sit on the sidelines and watch. So here's the thing. We talk about this verse 8, here I am, send me. And we talk a lot about sending and sending to the nations and sending to the ends of the earth. And that is definitely a possibility. That is definitely within the realm of what Isaiah is saying here. But you need to understand, Isaiah was not being sent to the ends of the earth. Isaiah was being sent to his people. He wasn't being sent all the way around the world. He was being sent to his own people. Now, it was a very tough message he was sent to deliver, for sure. But when you give God a blank check, this means not just going to the ends of the earth if God calls you. It means going all the way with God in your finances. It means going all the way with God in your time. It means going all the way with God in your job. It means going all the way across the street and telling your neighbor. It's not just, hey, let's go on a mission trip every year somewhere. Like this year we're going to Costa Rica, we've been to China, we've been to Indonesia. It's not just going on those trips so that we can say, oh, look at me, here I am, send me God, send me to China. Listen, China's 1 week out of the year. Costa Rica's 1 week out of the year. What are we doing with the other 51 weeks? So don't hear me saying this is just a call for everybody to go to Costa Rica. I would love for you all to go to Costa Rica. It's a beautiful place that has a lot of people in need of the gospel. Indonesia the same way. China the same way. Any of these places we can go, very much in need of the gospel. But my question is are we saying, God, send me? And what I mean by that is, are we giving God a blank check with our lives? Are we all in for the gospel? That's our theme in 2024. That we at New Shores are going to be all in 2024 for the gospel. You know what all in really looks like? It looks like, God, I'm giving you a blank check, whatever you want to do with me. You want to use me on Wednesday nights? Go ahead. Can I just let you in on a little bit? When you pray this prayer, and when you answer God's call and you say, here I am, send me, do you know that's probably going to mess up your schedule a little bit? I'm sure Isaiah had plenty of things to do. Sure, his schedule was plenty full. It's going to mess your schedule up. When you say, here I am, send me, it's going to mess your finances up. You're like, well, why would I ever mess my finances up? Can I tell you, it's not going to mess your finances up in a bad way. It's going to mess your finances up in a good way because you're opening yourself up to the blessing of God. I was sitting thinking as we're talking to this worship pastor, I'll just be brutally honest with you. Like, if God doesn't show up in our finances, this worship pastor thing is never going to work. Like, it's just not. And this isn't in my notes. You can tell I'm not reading from my notes. I wasn't even going to say this, but let me just say this. If people don't go all in our church with finances, this worship pastor, like, I'll probably be homeless by the end of the year. Not really, but that's how it feels. Okay, that's how it feels for this guy hiring somebody. Just being honest with you. You're like, well, BJ, why would you not do it? Because we've written a blank check to God and saying, God, what do you want us to do? And lead us and guide us. And our prayer through this whole process with this one guy, this is the second guy we've talked to, this one guy, God shut the door on the first guy. Here's how I view this. God, you open the door until you close it. And the minute you close it on either side, the minute he gets a check in his spirit, or his wife, the wives are usually the one that gets a check in their spirit, right? The minute that they get a check in their spirit that this is not where God's leading them, and the minute that we get a check in our spirit that we shouldn't be going there, then we're going to stop. But until then, I can't say, well, God, you get everything. God, I will follow you as long as the money starts coming in first. No, we follow God. We have been through a lot in this church. If you're new here, some of y'all, about the 20 of y'all that are left, y'all know, we have gone through a lot, and there were many a days where I had people that were very healthy givers come in my office and say, we're not going to church here anymore because you did this, this, or this. And all I did, to be honest with you, was just simply try to follow God the best I knew how. That's a hard day, by the way. I can imagine what Isaiah is going through when God says, hey, I want you to go give this terrible message that King Ahaz has led y'all astray, and there's going to be a lot of trouble coming your way. So we're just trying to follow God the best we can. And so here's my question. Have you given God a blank check with your life? Have you given God a blank check with your life? He's not going to call most of you, if any of you, to Africa for your life. He could. I'm not saying he won't. He's probably not. But here's my question for you. Would you be willing if he did? So it's not so much of I'm going to Africa. It's, God, wherever you want me to go, I'm going to go. Whatever you want me to give, I'm going to give. Whatever time you want me to give, I'm going to give. Okay, it messes up my schedule on Wednesday nights. Like I have this schedule where I go home and I watch Friends and I eat a bowl of ice cream on Wednesday night as soon as I get done with work, and it's going to mess it all up. Do you give God a blank check? Here's what I put in my notes. We haven't gotten to the here I am, send me because we haven't caught a true glimpse of who he is. When you catch a true glimpse of who God is and what he has done for you, there's no other response but here I am, send me. God, here I am. Have all my money if you want it. Here I am. Have all my time if you want it. I've told some of you, most of you, that I had dreams since I was a sophomore in high school of being an accountant. I know. Sorry, Dennis. It's not the most glamorous thing that people sit around and dream about most of the time, but I did. I dreamed about that. I was like, man, I'm going to work for one of the big 4 accounting firms, and I'm going to have a nice boat, and I'm going to have a white picket fence, I'm going to have a big house, and I'm going to have a couple of kids, and it's just going to be a great, great life that I've set up for myself. And as a freshman in college, as an accounting major, God wrecked my life. He came in and he said, I want you to be in ministry full time. Now, my dad is in full-time ministry, and my granddad was in ministry. And I knew what ministers make. And I knew that if I took that on, there was probably not going to be a boat. At least not the new one I was thinking about. There was probably not going to be a big house. Listen, you hear about the Joel Osteens of the world. 99.9999% of pastors never get to the Joel Osteen level. There's not going to be all this stuff, material-wise. And I fought it for a month. I didn't want to give God my blank check. I didn't want to give him my blank check because I'm going to have to ruin all my plans. And after all, my plans for myself are pretty good. My dreams that I have for myself are pretty good. And after a month of fighting, literally fighting within my soul, wrestling within my soul, God brought this realization to me. BJ, you could have the nicest boat in the world. You could have $1 million that you're making every year as you work your way up the corporate ladder. But is that worth more than you investing in souls and in the kingdom? And it pierced me right here. But that wasn't what did it. You know what did it? I was tired of fighting. I knew God was going to wreck my life until I said, you know what, I'm going to. Some of y'all, your life right now is being wrecked. Like, I just don't understand what's going on, blah, blah. Maybe it's because you haven't given God the blank check. Maybe he's asking you to give the blank check and you're holding on to it and you got it out, but you're holding on to it tight. God's just saying, let it go. We have a lady in our church, Katie Landfair. I've asked her if I could share this story. She's told me. She messaged me this morning. She said, I'm not going to be there, but you can still share my story. She had a kid start throwing up this morning, so only on Sundays does that happen, it seems like. But Katie had a very good corporate career, a very good salary. God called her. She felt like God was calling her to be a teacher. Teachers make okay pay, but they don't make what Katie was making. Katie had not a certificate to teach. She had to go back to school to get a certificate to teach. But she followed God in what she thought he was calling her to do. That's what she did. It was not easy. Not only was she giving up money, but she was having to go back to school. She struggled with it for a little bit, but she said, this is what I've got to do. This is what God's called me to do. She texted me this morning. She said, there have been so many blessings that have come from me following what God wanted me to do. She said, I couldn't even imagine what was out there. And yet she had 1 million reasons not to do it. She had a ton of reasons not to do it. Like, I'm thinking right now, as a husband of a school teacher, I don't want to go be a school teacher right now. In today's world, I applaud any of y'all who teach because it is very difficult. But God was blessing her, and that was Katie saying, you know what, God? I'm giving you a blank check with my life. Whatever you want me to do, I will do it. So my question is not, are we all just going to become teachers? God's not calling all of us to do that. We're thankful for that. But God is calling us to put our all on the table, to put a blank check on the table with our time, with our talent, with our treasures. Maybe He is calling you to go overseas for a short-term trip. Maybe He's calling you to go to Gladewater, Texas. Who really sits around and thinks about going to Gladewater, Texas? I didn't until a couple summers ago. Whatever God's calling you to do, you've got to do it. But before you do it, you've got to see God for who He is. You have to see yourself for who you were. And then you have to allow Him to change you. And then after He changes you, you see everything so much more clearly. I've lived my life with this for a long time, this motto, for about 25 years now. This fall, 25 years ago, this October, was when God called me into ministry and I finally gave up and surrendered. And here's what I say. God, wherever you want me to go, whatever you want me to do, even if you want me to go to little old Sweeney, Texas, actually Old Ocean, I had never heard of Old Ocean Sweeney when I got a phone call that day in February of 2013. I know some of you are like, how could you not hear of Sweeney in Old Ocean? It's not a popular destination, all right? It's not everybody's not looking to come here. But what I found when I got here is there are some incredible people that want to be used by God. And my prayer is that all of us would be all in with our time, with our finances, with our talents. And we just say, God, here I am, send me. So have you seen God for who he is? Have you seen that glory that Isaiah talks about? Let's pray together.